All right. Okay. Thanks, everyone, for joining once again. The title of my talk is Children's Perspectives on Becoming Absorbed in Stories. And it will be mostly about reading and partly also about engaging with stories in other modalities. My name is Anežka, as Justina said, and reading research is about as close as I get to a job description. I started out once as a literature scholar and then had a period of reinventing myself as a cognitive scientist of sorts, because I realized that I was mainly interested in readers and that I was primarily interested in text via their effects on actual people. But then eventually I realized that cognitive science didn't give me enough tools to explore the variations in readers' experiences. So now the only job description, or my preferred job description, is reading researcher, because that's broader. And I work at Charles University in Prague. What I've been doing over the past few years has been looking into children's inner embodied story experiences in the age bracket of 9 to 12. And it has been really quite a journey, which I enjoyed. It's about one of the best projects I've ever been involved in. Inner embodied story experiences is something that children are expected to have in order to evolve into engaged, avid readers, maybe in order to develop a reading habit for life. But they're very rarely asked about these experiences, and they're very rarely invited to reflect on these experiences in both formal and informal settings. So the question is, if you decide to explore such a thing in research, how do you ask? How do you ask if there's no discourse established for this area of children's experience? How do you ask if you want your way of asking to be systematic? How do you ask if you want it to be child-centered, to really keep the child in the center of the inquiry? And if you want it to be potentially enriching for practice, and by practice I mean educational practice as well, that is classroom practices, pedagogies. I have recently made 3 attempts at asking, and they have incidentally all been copyrighted 2022. So I'll give you a quick taste of all 3 of them, and then I'll focus on the most recent one in what remains of this talk. So the first one, that was a collaboration with Teresa Kremen of the Open University in England. And what I did was I asked children what their favorite story reminds them of, what sorts of memories it elicits in them. And this has recently appeared in the Cambridge Journal of Education. My second attempt was about asking what stories are like from within the reader's body. And in this research, it was no longer only about reading, but also about engaging with stories in other modalities. And this took place in Czechia with my current research team and has recently appeared in Literacy. And finally, the most recent attempt was about asking what it is like to be into a story, primarily in written form, but not only, what it's like to feel absorbed in a story, what it's like when a story feels engaging. So these have been my most recent ways of asking children about their story experiences. And I'll unpack the first 2 a little bit and then focus on the last one. So when it comes to the first one, what I did there was, methodologically, these were classroom interventions of sorts. I invited children in the UK to take part in classroom workshops where we chatted about stories evoking memories and sort of giving us a fresh look on our own life experiences. And the concept I used was the concept of reminding, or personal memories. So some of the things that the children did, for instance, was they were invited to listen to an audio snippet of a poem by Michael Rosen, who is a much beloved children's poet. The poem is a famous one called The Chocolate Cake, and the children were invited to make tally marks every time they noted that the story reminded them of something from their own life. But this was only a warm-up exercise. The actual gist of the study, or the actual data that I then used in analyzing the children's memories, consisted of the children's free writing, elaborating on what their own favorite stories that they had brought in from home reminded them of when they read them. And the analysis showed that this varies depending on what genre the story was. Okay. The second study, here the write-up is mostly about introducing the tools that we used to generate or to sort of make children reflect on their inner embodied experiences. The methodology was focus groups that were school-based and individual interviews that were home-based. And the reason for this switch in site, in venue, was COVID-19, which forced us out of schools into children's homes, and then eventually even made it impossible for us to engage with children in their own homes. But the tools we used consisted, for instance, in a canvas doll that we used as a proxy of the child that we were talking to, and that the child was invited to use to sort of, use as a stand-in for themselves in reflecting on their inner embodied experiences, but also on how their body was configured when they enjoyed stories the most, etc. Another tool that we used was this set of 3 color-coded plastic sheets that were transparent, could be transposed onto one another, and that represented 3 notional spaces that one's embodied mind can dwell in while engaging with a story. The space of being there in the story world, and the space of here, sort of being conscious of one's body situated in the room, and then the space of elsewhere, suggesting that one's mind has wandered off to other things that can be either related or unrelated to the story. And then another tool that we used was this pair of cards that were made of glossy card that were materialized metaphors for either experiencing one's favorite story as a mirror onto one's own life, or a window into a different world. So this is just a taste of what we used, what we've developed, and what seemed to work quite well, and what children seem to enjoy engaging with, fiddling with, to be more precise, during the research. Okay, now the last study, the one that dealt with absorption, is, as I said, the main focus of what I'll be talking about today. But what's the thing with the methodology that we used in this last study is that it draws on preliminary research that is conducted with a similar group of children or a similar group of participants more generally. And in this case, we used the previous study as a resource. So in a way, I'll be talking about both studies because the previous one served as a resource in modeling our research in the last study. Now, this last study used a methodology that is not widely known in the humanities or other disciplines for that matter, although it's growing in the social sciences currently. It's called Q methodology. And from what you can glean from this side, you can probably tell it's a card sorting activity of sorts. You ask your participants to sort cards onto a bell-shaped grid that is scaled. It can be scaled from this sounds most like me or least like me, or this is most enjoyable to me or least enjoyable to me. And what the participants are invited to sort are authentic statements that have been derived from the preliminary research in most cases. So in our case, these have largely, to maybe 95%, 90%, been derived from the middle study that I was showing you in the previous slides. Now, they were really two studies, two Q methodology studies, as you can see. And the one that I'll be mainly talking about, or almost exclusively talking about, had to do with story reading that used verbal statements. There was also another study that was run in the same sitting, and that was about experiencing stories across different sorts of activities, not just reading, but also listening, watching, making art, playing, thinking about it or chatting about it with friends, and also across different bodily situations. And I realized that in my abstract for this talk, I promised I would report on both studies. But as I started planning the talk, it just proved impossible to fit in the findings of both studies and still maintaining some decent level, some decent depth in what I was communicating. So I have to apologize to anyone who's been looking forward to the outcomes of both studies, because I'm going to have to sacrifice the one that used the pictorial stimuli. We can maybe talk about it during discussion if time permits. Okay. Now, of course, none of this work would have happened without my collaborators. My primary collaborators in this study were Markéta Supa and Martin Nekola, who did the data analysis and wrote the study up with me. Markéta is a childhood studies expert. Martin is a sociologist and a quant method specialist. We also had great help from two other members of my team, Jana Segilukavska and Filip Novak, who assisted us greatly in collecting the data, recruiting participants, and more. All right, now, why Q methodology in the first place? What's so special about it? So this notion of absorption, it's been out there for some time, explored by scholars in various fields. They all have one thing in common, namely they rely on primarily quantitative methods, and they measure absorption as a fixed construct using questionnaires such as the Story World Absorption Questionnaire that's been very helpful in various research studies in various fields. What this sort of research does, it defines what absorption is for you as participants, and then asks you to rate various statements, various facets of absorption, and then checks how absorbed you were during a particular narrative experience, to what extent you were absorbed according to this definition. And then there's qualitative research that, in my view, deals with absorption in one way or another, even though it maybe doesn't use the particular term of absorption, and where the idea is mostly asking participants what absorption is to them personally, sort of exploring what it means to individuals to be engaged with a story, to be deeply immersed in it, maybe. And the amazing thing about Q methodology is that it does a little bit of both. So it combines the benefits of both qualitative research, looking at individual variations in what it means to be absorbed or whatever, but also grasping them quantitatively, enabling comparisons, fairly reliable comparisons among the participants. And the output of a Q methodology study is always the definition of different trends in the data or different tendencies or perspectives that are out there. So the conclusion is not, this varies from person to person, so there's no one concept of absorption and there's no way of talking about it in a sort of unified way conceptually, but rather, look, there's actually different ways of being absorbed, but people cluster along certain dimensions of the experience. So we could actually roughly divide people's different experiences of absorption into a limited number of groups. Okay, so again, this is the Q sort that we used in our study. There were 24 statements. They were all derived, or most of them were derived from the preliminary research. The ones that weren't derived from the preliminary research were mainly derived from our pilots of this research. So it's all child-centered. It's all stuff that actual children told us or showed us or suggested to us. The statements are, sometimes they're kept sort of verbatim, the way we noted them down. More often they are slightly doctored so that more people can relate to them than just the person who told us about this sort of experience in the first instance. The philosophy behind Q methodology is that our consciousness or subjectivity can be operationalized in such a way that it is structured along a limited number of components or dimensions, and that these components, the different components, are salient to different degrees in different people, right? So as I said, the preliminary work was our inner embodied experiences study. And you can think of this work, the Q method study, as the final phase or final step in a 3-step process where we started out in schools running focus groups, which are by definition a social affair, where children share a certain type of experiences rather than others. And then we had to migrate into children's homes, which enabled us to see maybe other more private facets of children's engagement with stories. And then finally, we had to migrate into the online space because the Q method study had to be run online. That is not common with children until recently, at least. So you can think of it as reading reflected on and discussed across 3 different spaces as well. All right, in general, Q methodology is classified as a qualitative quantitative methodology, and it is inherently child-centered in that it exposes children to statements made by other children. A normal Q method study will have 20 to 50 participants who sort 20 to 60 statements onto this quasi-normal grid, and then are invited to reflect in interviews. That's an important moment, an important component of the data, because you not only ask participants to sort the different statements numerically, but then also invite them to reflect on the sorting procedure as such, and to motivate, to explain their most salient choices. By most salient, I mean the ones that have to do with the extreme placements on the sorting grid, the -3 and +3. And then maybe there's particular statements which are particularly interesting to you as a researcher, and then you choose to discuss these statements with each and every participant, regardless of where they appear on the sorting grid. And once you have the outcomes of the quantitative analysis, you're able to divide your participants into groups, into like number of groups, and then you use these groups and the transcripts of the qualitative data to understand the different perspectives represented by these groups. So Q methodology is special in the sense that, to a larger degree than any other quantitative method, data is really created in interaction rather than simply collected, because your participant is invited to reflect upon the statements, to interpret the statements for themselves, and then also provide you with their own understanding, in mutual interaction. It's, as I said, it's a growing approach in psychology, social work, youth studies, and also education, which is perhaps most relevant to this community. This particular paper reviews, I think, 74 different Q method studies in the field of education. Okay. So our study was number 2 of 2 in the sitting, as I already mentioned. The first study was the one that used the pictorial stimuli. We spoke to 28 children aged 9 to 12. They all came from Czechia, and they came from varied backgrounds in terms of how avid readers they were, to what extent they were bookworms or not, to what extent they lived in a literacy-rich environment in a traditional sense. They also varied as to their parents' degree of education. They varied as to whether they came from a rural or urban setting. Which else? They were gender balanced, of course, and they were balanced for age. So we spoke to these kids, interviewed them at great depth, and then ran the quantitative analysis. The quantitative analysis gave us 4 neat, I would say, groups of children, or rather 3 groups, but one of these groups was bipolar, meaning that the same cards were salient to these children, except for some of them, they were salient in the negative sense, and to others, they were salient in the positive sense. So they were really 4 perspectives. Okay. All right. So again, as for the 24 statements, just to give you a quick taste of what they were, you may have gleaned some of them looking at some of the slides that I've shown previously. What I would like to stress is that they differed in to what extent they concerned the story world, the experience of the world of the story. Those are the cards that I've chosen to highlight in pink for you. Reading, for instance, it's as if the same things were happening to me, or it's as if it were happening in front of my eyes, or I know how the characters feel. So these are all statements that have to do with the reader experiencing the world of the story proper. And then the ones I chose to highlight in green, they're more about the process of reading. They're more meta, as it were. So they read, for instance, I can't stop reading, or I always know what is happening around me. So this has little to do with the story world, but much to do with being immersed or absorbed in the activity of reading. And then the 2 I highlighted in purple, as you can see, they're more about the reader's ideas of what's interesting, what's motivating in a story, what makes one bother wanting to be absorbed in the first place. So, for instance, it must also be about things I like, or when I don't understand it, I don't enjoy it. Now, these that I've highlighted in this particular slide, they're not a random selection of items. They're actually these statements that proved to be distinguishing, statistically speaking. So these were the ones along which our 4 groups differed statistically. The remaining statements were mostly, they were not the ones that mattered so much when it came to distinguishing between the 4 groups. Okay, so finally, the 4 perspectives. There was one perspective that we chose to call the growth perspective, and the one that was statistically inverse to it. Remember, I mentioned the bipolar group was something we chose to call the confirmation perspective. And there was a perspective we call the attachment perspective and the mental shift perspective. And I'm intentionally calling them perspectives rather than groups or profiles, because we really think of them as something that's not fixed, that can be stuck onto a person like a label, but rather something that the children adopted, maybe in a particular life stage that we happen to interact with them in. There's something that can shift over time. Okay, here's a neat black and white overview of them, sort of a synchronous look at the 4 perspectives. And in what remains of this talk, I'll go through them one by one. So as for the growth perspective, for the children in the growth perspective, reading is really a rounded experience. It has a lot to do with not just the text, but also with one's sense of self. And there's a lot of focus on the sort of reflections that stories prompt in one. And the sort of reading that these children engage in is something that could be called long reading, in the sense that it doesn't stop when the children close the book. And that's only the beginning of something else, maybe a transformative process, you may call it. And when it comes to the embodied facets of reading, these kids have a very sort of whole body approach to stories, but only in particular sort of situations, namely when characters experience sort of heavily embodied things, such as when they're hurt, when somebody's shot maybe, or when there's strong sort of sensory perception, then they sort of adopt the character's whole body experiences. And I'm going to give you some quotes from these children to give you more substance, to give you more meat. So for instance, the children in the growth perspective would tell us things such as, then I think of all sorts of alternative solutions, speaking about the story. So I'll make the story last longer, so to speak. It can be several months even. Or they would tell us things such as, when there was a fight and somebody lost a tooth, at that moment I put my hand to my mouth. And when a character gets stabbed in the shoulder, I check my shoulder just in case, speaking about engaging with stories in a whole body manner. And then finally, there's a great deal of me working to live it through with the character, to help them with the sadness a little bit, but still being myself. And this is important because this is sort of in contrast to another perspective that I'll be talking about. Okay, here's what you call the composite thought of this group. That's something I've only inserted in case we need it during discussion. That's the ideal thought of this particular perspective. Okay, the confirmation perspective. For these kids, there's a clear prerequisite, a clear requirement for the text to be suspenseful, ideally from page 1. There's a lot of focus on the criteria that a text should fulfill in order for one to bother reading in the first place. And if these criteria are not met, then the children are ready to abandon reading at any point. And they're rather disembodied readers. This is one of the things that this is a clear sort of illustration of the bipolar nature of the first two perspectives, the growth and the confirmation. Again, some examples of what these children said. They said, for instance, when I'm bored, I skip the bit. When it's not interesting, I can quit easily. And they would say things such as, say, when there's old historical buildings in the story, then I don't like it. So the criteria that are applied regarding text, they can be of different sorts. They can have to do with the subject matter of the story. It can also be about genre. It can also be about, I don't know, whether there's images or not. But subject matter was quite common. And subject matter on a rather sort of granular level, such as when there's historical buildings appearing in the story, then I'm not interested. Okay. And finally, there was something particular about this perspective and imagining and sort of experiencing stories in an embodied manner. So these children would spontaneously mention how much they enjoy illustrations because they show them what they should imagine and how. And they would say things such as, what I do is I imagine it in my head, like I can see it, but it's not like I'm in the story or anything. Speaking about a rather disembodied way of reading. Okay, again, here's the composite sword, just in case we need it later. Now, the attachment perspective, that's a label that probably speaks for itself. So the children sharing this perspective bond very strongly on an emotional level with characters, something the growth perspective doesn't do much, actually. They're a more sort of analytical group or analytical perspective. These kids bond very strongly. They focus very strongly on characters. They reflect both on themselves and the text and the character as an other. And they become so strongly attached to characters, they can say things, they're ready to abandon a series in case the protagonist is changed between two different volumes in a series. What's very distinguishing and distinctive for this group is that for them, reading is about experiencing otherness. They very much want the story world to be distinct from their own reality. And I think this has to do with the fact that they bond with characters via the characters' plights. They're very particular about the characters' suffering. They're very particular about characters' death. That was a strong topic for these kids. And this otherness, such as the story being set in a fantasy world, is a sort of filter for them between the suffering and their experience. So the attachment group would say things such as, sometimes I skip to the last page to see the main character still there, so I know he doesn't die. This is very common, even with fairly light genres, as it were. When it comes to moments when the characters suffer, or when it's sort of not clear how things are going to turn out, they will say things such as, it gives me a total stomachache. It's like everything's just boiling inside me. And as for the otherness aspect, they will say things such as, I like it when it's in the future or in the past, and all kinds of magic too. Lots of grown-ups like reading about life, but that's not for me. Okay, here's again the composite sort. And finally, the last perspective, the mental shift perspective. These were a very interesting group, or an interesting perspective from an educational point of view, the viewpoint of a literacy practitioner, because the only thing that they agreed on when it came to the experience of being absorbed was experiencing an altered sense of time. Apart from that, there wasn't much about the story world or oneself that they agreed on, because their main focus, at least in the way they talked about absorption, was a focus on becoming absorbed rather than a focus on what happens once one has become absorbed. They read for mastery, or that's the way they reflect on it. Their accounts of reading were very much about being accurate and proficient and literate enough, as it were. And on the map of their body, they place reading inside their head. So they would tell us things such as, I can completely forget about time and go on reading and I just can't stop. Or I just read on and on and on, and suddenly it's 9 o'clock instead of 8. And this is very typical in the sense that they gave us very precise indicators of the quality of their reading that were quantitative in nature, such as that one reads for a certain amount of time, or maybe one manages to read a certain number of pages, stuff like that. They were very much focused on giving us a taste of what it's like to engage with reading on a moment-to-moment basis. Okay. When it came to placing reading inside their head rather than anywhere else on the map of their body, they told us things such as, when I'm imagining it, I'm like teasing apart the different little bits in my head so I can understand it better. So even imagining a fairly unambiguous word in Czech as well as in English, in the sense of what, or when it comes to its scope, was fairly constrained to actually mental work to understand the story rather than anything else. They would also say things such as, like when it says Adelka opened the door, then I'm just reading on, and by the time I get to the door, I don't remember Adelka opened anymore. So it was about really the moment-to-moment working of one's brain in interaction with the text. And finally, they would tell us, a good reader is, say, someone who makes 0 to 3 mistakes in a chapter and who reads quite quickly. And this is very typical for this perspective. That's something that was really unique for it, in the sense that we had this one card that we chose to discuss with every single child in the study, regardless of where it was placed on the grid, and that was, I'm a good reader. We wanted to hear about children's perspectives on being a good reader. And this is the only perspective, the only group who unanimously only defined a good reader in technical terms, such as somebody who makes 0 to 3 mistakes, or somebody who reads such and such amount of pages in a given period of time. This technical approach to being a good reader appeared in the other groups as well, but it was always mixed with something else on top. Either, I don't know, enjoying a broad variety of genres, or maybe having chatting about what one reads, stuff like that. So there was always a component of something else but the technical mastery, not in this perspective. Okay, so here's one final synchronous look at the 4 perspectives, where I've chosen to highlight the embodied aspect because that's what I started with. And what fascinates me in the mental shift perspective, especially the experience of becoming absorbed rather than what happens once one has become absorbed. Okay, the study that I've just reported on is available open access in Frontiers in Psychology. Just like the first one I mentioned at the very beginning, the one that's been published in the Cambridge Journal of Education, but I'm happy to share also the middle study, of course. But my main message is that the kids really loved the activity. It really worked like a charm. It was almost miraculous how easy it was for the children to reflect on these very, when you think about it, elusive experiences. And this had to do with the fact that what the children were reflecting on was other children's statements. So that's my bottom line today. To try it out, regardless of whether you're a researcher or a practitioner, because it really did wonders for what the children, the sort of experiences they were able to express for us. So thanks very much for your attention. These are my references for today, and do watch this space or get in touch if you want any of the studies or any details. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Anežka, for this fascinating insight into your research and into young readers' reflections. I mean, that's just amazing, and I took a lot in terms of from you, in terms of and from what you said in terms of methodological tools. I do appreciate it. Thank you. There were signs of applause as well, the clapping hands. I hope you saw them. And now we have time for questions, comments. So please, you can put them once again in the chat if you have access to the chat, or you can just pose questions. I don't see any comments at the moment, not yet. The chat. I may ask a question, and that's maybe a kind of too obvious question. Oh, there is a question from Margaret. So maybe Margaret first, and then if there are no other questions, I will ask a question, please.
I thank you, Anežka. That's so interesting, and it's the sophisticated methodology is so appealing. What do you think would happen? I don't suppose you did it from what you say, but what do you think would happen if you got the children to discuss the differences amongst these groups? Do you think that would be meaningful to them, or do you think they would be so absorbed in their own perspective that the rest would just seem alien?
Well, that's sort of something I'm hoping to do at some other point.
Right.
On my journey. the thing is, these perspectives are something that emerged from statistical analyses. So these are descriptions. What I gave you are interpretations of how the different children sort of compiled their own inverted pyramids. So for me, the first step would be if we didn't run this online and we're more sort of naturally in touch with the participants. For instance, if we ran this in person, the way Q method studies are often done, my next step would be to present the children with the descriptions of the perspectives they happen to fall into, as it were, and ask them what they thought about that, sort of on an individual level, because we weren't even able to do that. Right. And then, as a next step, of course, asking children to share their views, maybe in small groups, and sort of confront them with others. I think it would be very, very helpful, and I know that you do think so too. At least along some of the perspectives, like when it comes to imagining, for instance. Imagining means so many different things to people, and most people don't realize because we're so hung up on the ways we read ourselves, and it's difficult to. So yeah, it's difficult to imagine how other people imagine, as it were, how other people imagine. But so yes, that is definitely appealing to me.
The only model we have for reading in many important ways is the one that's inside our own head.
Right.
Everything else is a report from outside. When I talk about this with adults, disbelief is very often the first reaction. People are so startled to think that there even is more than one way of imagining or being inside a story or being outside a story looking on.
Yeah. I know. And yeah, the thing is that there's one teacher to a class normally,
right,
who will assume their way of reading is the way of reading. So that's that is the first obstacle you have to overcome as a student or a pupil in a class. If you're lucky, your teacher's way of reading is similar to yours. Yeah. But then statistically, by necessity, most of the kids' way of reading will be different from the teacher's. Yeah.
Well, if you're lucky, the teacher's way of reading will be different if the teacher is aware enough to make a point of that. One of the things that I've found with my students, and I'll stop talking after this, I don't visualize, and the visualizers are always torn between thinking she's the teacher, we should pay attention, and thinking she's crazy. That's not how people read. So it can be interesting if the teacher can bring that in.
Right.
Anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you for the question and the comments, and Anežka, thank you for your comments and answers. Have you had any chance to share this research with teachers, with educators, reading promoters? And what was their reaction then, and what they thought about it?
I've had I'm having this opportunity now a lot. I get to talk. My work's getting a fair amount of media attention at the moment. And so I get to talk to people in the media. I get to talk to people from education charities or organizations, and they're all fascinated. I'm happy to say,
right?
Surprised as well. So this work has appeared in a very fortunate moment in my career, as it were, because I happen to be, there's a window of time now when I get a lot of opportunity to disseminate it. So it's getting a lot of attention. Yeah.
Wonderful, great. We have comments in the chat, so I will read, and questions. I will read the first one and then the second one. So the first one is from Natalia. She says, very interesting presentation. What books did you choose for the study, and what was the choice based on? All kids read the same books. I noted 4 titles from the slides.
All right. So the Q method study, the one that made up the bulk of this presentation, this was a general conversation about reading. So we didn't focus on any particular work, but the children would often mention specific titles that they liked. And in my slideshow, I tried to approximate the typical choices of the different perspectives. In some cases, I actually picked the very particular titles that the children liked. So the Christopher Paolini book cover, and the J.K. Rowling, and what was the Warriors book. They were actual choices that the children mentioned in the particular perspectives, and that I somehow felt were in some way typical for what they told us about reading in general. Then for one of the slides, for the confirmation group, I chose the book cover of Emma Carroll's Letters from the Lighthouse. And in this case, it's not like anybody has read Letters from the Lighthouse in Czechia, because it's not been translated into Czech, unless they read it in English, of course. But it was the book that I could think of that was written in English that was close enough to the typical book choice of this particular group, which was an adventure story that was fairly suspenseful from page one, had multiple characters. What more was my criterion? I'm not sure, except for that one little glitch that it had a historical building on the cover. Mm-hmm. And there was this one quote that I used, but this was more like on a general level, a quote demonstrating that the children can be very particular about the things they don't like in a story. But in general, in the sample, there were very many children who either exclusively or very much preferred fantasy genres.
Yeah.
And I think, fantasy, fantasy literature generally is very big with children, right? The one group who more or less exclusively read fantasy were the attachment kids, mm-hmm. or the attachment perspective, to be fair. And this was sort of in line with their preference for feeling or experiencing the story as something very distinctive from their own everyday experience.
Okay, thank you. So the second comment and question from the chat, and Natalia says thank you as well in the chat.
Thank you for the question.
And then we have a question from Kira as well. So first, Alan in the chat. So he says, Dear Dr. Kuzmičová, thank you very much for your insightful and inspiring lecture. I bet that there is something which may prove useful and interesting for literary researchers and didacticists. Would you be able to find any implications for foreign language teachers who wish to incorporate books into the learning process, especially for younger children? In other words, how should teachers include reading material into the classroom in a way which will leave the students interested in literature?
Wow, so, foreign language teaching. For foreign language teaching, what I would focus on is having as much multimodality in the material as possible, but that's probably something every foreign language teacher knows, like having a lot of images. Speaking of the kids who really praise illustrations as a resource for being able to imagine. When it comes to the four perspectives and foreign language teaching, this is an interesting question that I never thought about. I'm not really sure if there's anything I can say that's of any substance about it, but I'm going to have to think about it. There'll probably be one thing. So this study was about reading in your mother tongue, and there'll probably be another set of perspectives for reading in an L2, which you'd have to explore using key methodology, or not necessarily key methodology. I mean, that's what my bottom line was about. You can design activities for your teaching wherein children are invited to think about statements made by other children without necessarily going all the way and running these statistical analyses and stuff like that, but just for the sake of having children reflect this way. So that's something I would try. I would try to explore as a foreign language teacher or somebody sort of dealing with this topic on a research level. Try to look at what the different tendencies will be among L2 learners when it comes to reading literature. There'll be a different set of perspectives, I'm sure.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Alan, for the question. And Anežka, thank you. And Alan says, I'm sorry, I don't speak Czech, but pekne děkuji. Thank you very much. Apologies, Alan, for my pronunciation as well, and Anežka, of course, as well. Kira, please, a question from you.
Hi, sorry, I can't get, oh, yes, there's my camera. I think it's working.
Yes, it is.
Thank you so much, Anežka. That was absolutely fascinating. And actually what I wanted to ask you about, you have just sort of been alluding to, and that's the whole question of images and words. And it just strikes me that this is a particularly interesting sort of age group in terms of chapter books, and the kind of, the images are still there, but we're not in, it's sort of an in-between kind of phase. It's quite interesting. And so I was wondering if the children were kind of talking about the entire package or whether they differentiated. And I suppose that then leads me on to another question, which would be around kind of story in different ways, and kind of not just images, but then how whether sound is also playing a part in terms of when they listen to stories, and whether they talk about, whether they themselves differentiate between those experiences.
Oh, these are really nice questions. So I'll start with the first one about imagery and illustrations. So this is something that differentiated the four perspectives as well, in the sense that the confirmation perspective, they required illustrations, and they felt this was a sort of insurance for their imagery to be accurate, or to even sort of get started in the first place. Whereas the perspective that was inverse to this group, the growth kids, they explicitly and spontaneously mentioned they hated illustrations because they curbed their imaginative autonomy. This is also something that came up a lot in the first Q study that used the little pictures instead of verbal statements, where reading was compared to other modes of engaging with stories, and where the children would spontaneously begin elaborating on these different modes in terms of this sort of imagery or imagination they afford, as it were. And you also mentioned sound and listening to stories. And again, this is more prominent in the first study that I haven't been able to elaborate on. And that's still forthcoming. It's still under peer review. And here we had children, I remember, who would say that sound, imagined sound, was something that they liked about reading. So there were a few kids who would say they didn't make up a whole sort of perspective, statistically speaking, but I think they all happened to fall within one group, who would say, what I like about reading and reading silently to myself is hearing my own voice inside my head, as it were. So that's the connection between imagining and sound. And then there was a lot of talk about listening to somebody else reading or listening to audiobooks. And then there were all sorts of ideas about whether this is better or worse than reading silently, and then we have a whole sort of perspective structure about that. But this inner voice was interesting, that it came up spontaneously among the kids.
Thank you very much for the answer in the first place, for the question in the first place, and then the questions actually and answers. Thank you. Do we have any more comments and questions? I can't see any in the chat, and I can't see any raised hands either. If I may ask maybe a kind of tangential question, But I was very intrigued when you mentioned how you dealt with the pandemic and the obstacles that it caused to your research, and then how you kind of had access to home spaces. So could you maybe comment on, has anything, or did anything especially intriguing, interesting come up out of this engagement, your engagement as researchers with these home spaces and reading at home?
Mm-hmm. So this forced transition into the home space, it was a very short period of time, because in Czechia where we worked, the government was very quick to respond to the first wave of the pandemic. So everything shut down. And as a result of that, there were very few cases of COVID-19 during the first wave. And so for a bit, we figured for a bit, it was okay to go into children's homes instead of schools. But then this window of opportunity sort of shut quickly. Yeah. But so this was a very brief period of time. But the transition enabled us to ask the children to give us a guided tour of their natural literacy environments. So we got a lot of extra data, a lot of extra insight into their reading practices and story engagement practices more generally. There were often siblings in the homes that were important parts of their story experiences. Sometimes they were even present when the research was taking place. So it was so naturally we got to talk much more with the children about their natural about the social aspects of reading. Even though these were individual interviews as opposed to the focus groups, we got to learn more about how other people mattered in the children's experiences. So that's just one of many things that came out of this.
Were parents in any way involved as well?
They were
just hanging around in a way, right? And
we made sure to keep them in the right. They kept in the background. Most of them voluntarily. We didn't have to sort of send them off. Because we were interested in the children's sort of uncensored accounts of reading and accounts of what it means to be engaging with a story. Because unlike the Q study, during these individual interviews in children's homes and focus groups, we also had moments when we exposed the children to stories that we had chosen ourselves. So this was a different design. It was not just a general sort of conversation about stories and reading, but also we had story snippets that we read to the children. Sometimes the children preferred to read them to themselves. We also had little snippets of story videos, like little film snippets that the children watched and then talked about. And then of course, for something like that, you need to be you don't want the parents to hang around and to sort of interfere with the situation.
Although on the other hand, if you think about this, I would imagine that there is a lot of this kind of interaction, intergenerational interaction going on anyway. So I guess it's kind of tricky on one hand trying to distill children's individual engagement and then this kind of shared engagement, whether with siblings or friends, peers, and or parents or other adults. I don't know, but I guess you can kind of try definitely and make sure that it's working in the research design.
Right. We didn't sort of draw any dramatic conclusions.
Sure.
From this, it was mostly about the sort of things that are ways of asking and the props that we developed afforded in the situations and in the children.
Do we have other comments, questions? I can't see any comments. So maybe one more question, or maybe two questions, in fact, from me. So do you think that there would be any differences if we were talking about all the children, teenagers, have there been any studies of absorption with teen readers?
So there's this study that I used in one of my slides by Jeffrey Wilhelm.
Okay.
And
yes,
he worked with teenagers. And he described in a very neat manner to me different facets of being engaged with stories. He doesn't use the term absorption, but he described teenagers' engagement with their preferred genres. And one of his cohorts were also children who preferred genres that were considered sort of marginalized or frowned upon in school settings, such as vampire stories, romance, stuff like that. And that's a really nice piece of research. The only thing, what makes our study different is that, or rather, what Wilhelm does is he describes these different facets, and then he says, well, I found all of them in every single reader, as it were. So he doesn't make that step of distinguishing that these different facets matter to different degrees in different people. But there is, so I know of this work, and Margaret, who's in the audience, has done work with teenagers and people reminiscing about their teenage, which I always enjoy reading.
I think maybe Alison Waller did a little bit of research like that, but of course with adults kind of going back to the past, let's say, and to their childhood experiences with reading. And another question, if I may, what would be the further lines of research for you going? I mean, related to what you've been doing, or maybe some new directions. So you may, of course, share.
So I'm kind of torn at this point because I feel that a moment has come when I can do a lot disseminating this work among the public here in Czechia. And then I should really focus on developing ways of stuff such as what Margaret mentioned, like maybe presenting these things to children, educators, maybe having children sort of modeling ways of really fruitful ways of sort of exchanging views in classrooms, stuff like that. So the thing is, I've also, my mind is set on embarking on a new journey in the sense that I've become very interested in exploring other ways of reading that don't have to do with stories. Or maybe reading that is where the story is not the main thing. So I'm going to start looking at children's engagement with non-stories and non-fiction content and see what comes out of that. So there'll be, I think I'll be, I'll be multitasking a lot in the years to come, I think.
I'm really looking forward to this new research that you are going to do. And I'll definitely, I'm sure a lot of us will have a look at your publications. Some of you haven't done that before. There's still maybe time for one question or comment. Okay, well, there are none. No suggestions, no comments, but let me thank you, Anežka, for this lovely talk and for showing us so many facets of becoming engaged with stories. I could recognize some that things that I do when I read as well. So maybe that's for another talk, how much we share, how much we change as we grow up, or maybe we grow sideways as well. But that was fascinating also for me personally, kind of to think how much, and I'm a fantasy lover, so a lot, I think, appealed to me personally. Thank you so much, and many thanks to the audience as well for all the comments and questions and for being here with us.